What's up, guys? It's John with National Sports Entertainment. And as the title suggests, I've been wanting to do something like this for a while, simply because the whole reason that it's been several years ago now at this point, I noticed that the NFL, the NBA, these leagues are definitely scripted in my opinion. I've made up my mind, but it's always subject to change if somebody brought me some compelling evidence, which, as you can see, there's not much evidence that they aren't essentially the same thing. But anyway, my rationale for believing it's scripted came mostly from wrestling. It wasn't really watching things the players were doing. It was, but it was more so noticing the commonalities in what they do in the NFL, the NBA, and what happens in wrestling. So, if you'll indulge me for a bit, I want to go into and this is just some of the ways that the NFL has copied WWE and sports entertainment in general. So, like I said, there's no shortage of comparisons, parallels, and commonalities between the WWE, NFL, NBA, and all the other sports. It's to different extents, I believe. I don't think hockey is as scripted as the NFL or NBA. That's just my opinion. And it's the same with baseball. I think they keep some sports where basically they're still going to get the outcomes they want, but they don't care as much about the narratives. I think they understand too. It's where your market is. So you have way more people watching NFL and NBA. And like I went into, you have to understand, like, it's not really a hot take to think that the same people that created Mickey Mouse might script games. So if you could bear with me, I think a great place to start is looking at the very beginning. So Vince McMahon created WrestleMania. This was to turn an event into a movie-like spectacle. So being a fellow exploit and boss-level opportunist himself, he did take this inspiration from the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl, of course, was a once-in-a-year event where the absolute best played each other and the winner would be the champion. Now, what happened with the Super Bowl, and this is something that, again, it's one of the first examples of the NFL. I can scroll through these guys while I'm talking about this. We can see the comparisons. It's one of the first examples of the NFL blatantly copying WWE. And like I said, Vince himself has copied Marvel. I'll go into that in a bit. So everybody takes inspiration from others, but this is supposed to be, again, a competitive game. And what they did was, before you saw WrestleMania, and they had these spectacles, and they had celebrities coming out, all sorts of things. By the way, LT was at the first WrestleMania, which by the way, was a top NFL guy, of course, at the time, and he's main eventing WrestleMania. But before we got these WrestleMania spectacles, you weren't seeing these stars at the Super Bowl halftime show. You were seeing bluegrass bands and marching bands from high schools. And then suddenly we started seeing Neil Diamond, Michael Jackson, all these stars. And this was, in my opinion, just to match what WWE was doing. They would also bring back the legends. WWE was known for this, bringing legends back for WrestleMania. This is around the time, and this didn't really happen more until like the 90s and even early 2000s, where they really showcased the legends coming for the Super Bowl, or in a lot of cases, if it's a team, say it's the Ravens, and now you see Ray Lewis showing up, etc. They weren't doing all of that spotlighting before. It was just basically a game. And again, it wasn't like people weren't turning out. But it wasn't until wrestling started doing these things, predominantly, like I said, with their halftime show, they really went ahead and just matched WWE. Now, what's interesting about not only the Super Bowl, but every major sport, and again, this all kind of ties together, you should see the reactions of some of these people when they get the real championship. I think it's a way Triple H is just kind of jabbing at these other leagues. WWE knows. If you watch John Cena talk about the ESPYs at the ESPYs, there's a reason they sat there, their faces turned 9 shades of red, and he was not invited back. He basically pulled the Ricky Gervais in a more professional way and exposed exactly how they script games and push players, all these different things. So those things are where I believe that's what makes me believe WWE does know what they're up to. So they always get a belt, the champions. And just look at Giannis react to his WWE belt with the awe of a 7-year-old, and look how he reacts when he gets his ring or when he's raising the championship. Not that he's not happy, but you would think he'd be a little more happy about one than the other. And to me, he is. It's just he's happier about the wrong one. So that's just going into the Super Bowl, how they're treated, and basically the beginning of it all. It's the prelude. Going into what I think is one of the most important aspects, obviously, is going to be the appeal to the fans. So, well, this one's wrong. Roger is Vince. Even if Trips is in charge now, Vince McMahon is just the guy overseeing everything. Actually, I guess Vince might be the owners of the teams collectively. I don't think the collective owners of the teams have the greed, the genius, and the opportunistic nature of Vince. I would put him up against the 32 owners collectively. He's just that insane. I mean that as a compliment, and you could take it as an insult too, but the dude is just on another level. But anyway, back to my point. Appealing to the fans it's everything. Without fans, you don't have anything outside of the sports bettors, and even that alone is not enough for the NFL alone, too. Disney, I should say, to succeed with the NFL expenditure. So you need, in my opinion, it's not even an opinion, you need the fans. I mean, I think everybody can agree on that. So, making stars, and again, this is something where the NFL has just matched WWF, WWE, tit for tat every step of the way. So in the 70s, 80s, there really wasn't that one guy. I am going to go into that one guy in a minute because there's one guy that comes to mind. In the NBA, you had Dr. J. I think he was ahead of his time, and so was Wilt. But Dr. J, as far as Flash, and that's not the guy I'm talking about, but of course he came from Philly, which is the most passionate market. But there's another guy that's just, you'll see why it's so obvious that this guy was made into a star. But in the 70s, 80s, early 80s, I should say, you really didn't have that. And you didn't have it in wrestling either. You had the Von Erichs, you had Flair, but he wasn't Flair at the time. The NWA guys, for my hardcore wrestling fans, you had Dusty. But again, you didn't have Hulk quite yet. We didn't have the Ultimate Warrior, all these guys quite yet. In the NBA, again, we had Kareem, we had Dr. J, we had Pistol Pete, we had Ewing. We had a lot of these guys, but nobody was really being pushed as a megastar yet. They were considered the best, and they were considered they're the top in the sport, maybe even in all sports, but they weren't being referred to as stars. Now WWE started doing this. Now there's one guy, and he's from the NFL, and I think he's the perfect example, and his nickname completely suits it. This guy shouldn't have been a bench warmer on any team. Okay, if you look at his statistics, if you watch the way he played, there's no reason this guy should have started outside of he probably had connections and they liked him. And the guy I'm talking about, I grew up a Jets fan, and this guy brought the Jets their only Super Bowl. But again, it's all smoke and mirrors. Of course I'm referring to Broadway Joe. Now, George Blanda, Otto Graham, better quarterbacks before him, did not get the treatment he got. I do think it's fitting he won Super Bowl III the same year, well, not the same year, but it's the same installment, WrestleMania 3, where Andre got slammed by Hogan. It was a giant underdog story. But again, what's interesting about this one is Joe Namath, Broadway Joe. And that's why he got that nickname, because back then they didn't have these stars. So for somebody to have the charisma he did, the fact that he was a walking pipe bomb and a ratings draw, was enough for them to absolutely love the guy. So he wouldn't have been a starter, let alone a Hall of Famer, if it wasn't for the fact that he had charisma. And I'm going to go into this with other athletes as well, other actors I should say, because just to put in perspective, this man had a 50% completion percentage and he threw 47 more interceptions than touchdowns. I knew he was bad, but I just checked the stats to make sure that that he was as bad as I remember. And just to put in perspective, worse numbers than Zach Wilson. I mean, it's insane if you think about it. And people actually believe this man's a Hall of Famer. And what did he do? Well, he told an amazing story. He guaranteed a victory. By the way, that was a heavily scripted Super Bowl. The owner of the Colts was putting money on the Jets. And he even said, I am a businessman and there's nothing wrong with it because it was legal, and it still is. It is legal to script games. And I don't think that can be emphasized enough. You would think they would easily make a rule that it should not be legal to script games, and it would quiet a lot of the skeptics, but of course they did not. So that, you could look into the Super Bowl 3 yourself, but there's so much surrounding that. He guarantees victory. They say he saved the Super Bowl because the AFC, or the American Conference, won, and it was getting stale, and they were going to completely reformat it. You know, he was drunk at the bar the night before. It's a great story. It's like the MJ flu story. Again, it's kind of like Hogan slamming Andre. Now, flash into the more modern times, and again, maybe it's just a coincidence that the biggest draw in the history of basketball just happens to be from the second biggest wrestling fan base. But if you look at Michael Jordan, when he started getting his push, it coincided with Hogan getting his. And this was when they started pushing the other guys, and I'm going to go into them in a second. But again, now we're talking late 80s, early 90s. Hogan was mid 80s, but I would say more late 80s. So their pushes almost came around the same time. And again, I genuinely believe the NFL, the NBA, we're starting to see what WWE and the other companies were doing, but at this time it was still really WWF. WCW wasn't really much yet. NWA was basically breeding guys to go to WWF and become bigger stars. But that's when we started seeing the Macho Man, a different type of Andre. We had Hulk, we had Warrior, and just a bunch of stars, stars in the NFL. Again, they even had Lawrence Taylor. And now gimmicks and rivalries at the same time. We got a lot of rivalries and gimmicks. And I'm not just talking about the WWF. Again, around this time, it wasn't the Lakers and Celtics anymore. It became Magic versus Bird. We really weren't seeing this in the past. But once we started seeing it in wrestling, now we start seeing it. Now, Magic and Bird, again, I mean, they go back to the late 70s. So they do predate a lot of the wrestlers. But the rivalry aspect was tit for tat as far as making this about individuals versus about teams. And these were the only two guys besides Michael, who would come a little later, that were treated as true megastars. Now, WWE continued this, the rivalry. They have, obviously, to this day. It was more realistic back in the day. Obviously, they did it, I'd say, all the way up until Bret and Shawn, which was, anyone that knows wrestling knows Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, the real Montreal Screwjob. But even then, there was one mega draw, and it was Hulk Hogan in WCW. Austin wasn't there yet, and it was Hulk. And again, it reminds me of Michael Jordan, essentially. He was the main guy of all sports. Now, that's just one example of again, how they push people, how they push these rivalries. And I'll go deeper into Larry and Magic. I'm about to. But if you look at the NFL, you'll see they were doing the same thing. We started getting Dion, Dan Marino, Joe Montana. Now, some of these guys predate the others a little bit, but they're mostly around the same era. Barry, Ronnie Lott. Just these stars that all had a unique, innate ability that nobody else had. And I think it's because they understood, just like WWE did, and they saw it was working there, that people could relate much more to individual characters than just a team. And of course, with the players being branded, there was much, much more money to be had. So as I said, we've had our share of rivalries, but I wanted to expound on one of the greatest that I can think of, and that's, again, Larry versus Magic. Now, if I had to, while I'm looking at this, I might as well just go into, honestly, if I had to compare these two, Larry to wrestlers, I think Larry would fit Mr. Perfect. Especially the stories they tell about him now. It's almost like they and they do this a lot, just glorifying him more. And not just Larry. Actually, Larry gets buried compared to most other basketball players, but they all have to have a gimmick. And he was just the arrogant guy. He was clutch, but he was respected. He reminds me of like a Roddy Piper mixed with a Mr. Perfect, and that makes him perfect for Boston. In Magic, he'd be like a Bret Hart. The dude was just like perfect all around. He was execution. He had flash. He really had it all. So, again, Larry's gimmick was a very simple one. He was just the white boy who was bad, like not mess with him. And I think that's why Boston was a perfect market for him. And that's another thing I wanted to go into, the different marketing. WWE did this, of course. They had certain wrestlers, like from Canada, like Bret, would fight certain wrestlers from New York or Texas, and they'd have different styles, and the fans would react much differently to Bret Hart in Texas than they would in Canada, and Steve Austin, Jake the Snake, when they were in different territories. And East versus West is a real thing. I mean, it was back then. Anyone that knows of Biggie and Tupac understands it was a very real thing. So I don't think it's a coincidence that they had Larry in Boston and they had Magic Johnson in LA, and it just made for a perfect rivalry where you're going to have people incredibly invested, and it's going to be ratings. And again, Magic's nickname is his gimmick. He was a magician. And there's a lot of wrestlers that I could compare to, or compare to basketball players, compare to football players. The one that really jumps out at me is Undertaker. He really is like Tim Duncan. The guy that doesn't get enough credit. The fundamental guy, does everything the right way, locker room leader. I always think of those two. Dirk Nowitzki's another one that could be like an Undertaker. And then Stone Cold and Michael Jordan I always compare because, again, by every metric as far as money, Michael Jordan's the biggest draw of all time. And that's why they call him the greatest. It's not because of his accolades, because if it was, Kareem would be the greatest. But it's because, like Stone Cold, you cannot doubt. Hogan did for a while, but when Austin came on the scene, there was just no questioning it. He was the biggest draw, still is. The guy is number 2 in merchandise sales this year. The only legend on the list, number 1, is Cody Rhodes. So, and it's the same with Michael for basketball. So, it's pretty easy to see, like going into Namath and going into, if you really look at Michael versus Kareem, if you put their stats together, and not even their stats, but their accomplishments, their longevity, the fact that Michael's just far and away considered much better, it's all booking. And a lot of it's politicking, a lot of it is, again, the guy had a sneaker deal. They wanted someone for that sneaker deal. And again, I'm going to go into that in a bit too, because I don't want to stray off topic, but I really wanted to make sure I explain why I see these similarities between wrestling and football and basketball. And again, beyond the theatrics that they copy, they really adopted the rivalries and they really adopted the gimmicks. And that's, as you can see today, if you watch wrestling and watch sports, it's the same essentially. So, and I shouldn't say and sports, I should say and other sports entertainment. Now, the absolute most pivotal part of everything I've gone into at the end of the day is draws. Because at the end of the day, again, these guys are business people, the owners of these teams. Disney owns ESPN, the networks, they're business people. If a team goes undefeated every year, but they're just so boring and nobody wants to watch them and they're losing money, outside of the manipulated sports betting money, then they're not going to continue. They're just going to bring in people that can make money. They're going to rather a team go winless and have someone that can make them money than a team go undefeated and they're losing money. So today it's just abundantly obvious. You have social media, but back in the day it was much more subtle. And like I said, MJ is the best example because he had a shoe deal where they were waiting on a guy that was marketable enough so they could be pushed no matter what. And the fact is, he is the biggest draw in the history of basketball. And that's why they treat him like he's the best. Just like Steve Austin. He wasn't the best wrestler, technical wrestler of all time. He wasn't the most realistic champion. But the consensus of the world is he's the greatest of all time, and I agree with that. Now, Lance Storm was 50 times the wrestler Steve Austin would ever be, but he had the personality of a stalk of celery. So compared to Austin, who had the most fiery personality in the world, there just really wasn't going to be a comparison. So there's so many wrestlers that fans are like, oh, this guy was so much better. But again, it's wrestling, it's entertainment. And basketball is the same way. You know, you do have people like Jokic makes it work. Like, he literally makes being boring work because they just consider it a quirk of his. Oh, it's just a 9 to 5 job. And they've even turned his non personality into a gimmick. So they're very impressive with how they're able to do that. You know, basically a walking robot now, has a gimmick of being this walking robot, whatever you want to call him. And again, I'd wager to say if MJ doesn't have the charisma and intensity that he does, Len Bias probably becomes the greatest player of all time, because they were going to pick whoever was going to draw more. MJ, again, we have the story of him being cut from his basketball team. That probably did happen. I'm not saying it didn't. But of course they're going to milk that story. They're going to milk everything they can to make him come off as the greatest of all time. So they're always going to push draws. Now, again, MJ inspired so many people, so many fans to want to become basketball players. He made them the most money ever. He had connections with the mob. So of course MJ was going to be their guy. Now, there are some guys who just never get their love. Barry Sanders is a good example of a guy who never got the love. And when you have that many teams, it's just going to happen. You're not going to have every draw of all time get their championship. You see it in the NBA now with a lot of players that definitely aren't going to get one. But another example, in my opinion, of just how they copy WWE with the storylines and the draws is if we look at, and a lot of people wanted me to go back into different games that were blatantly rigged. We don't have to go much further back than 2001. People remember what happened with the Kings and Lakers, but let's talk. That was 2002, I believe. But let's talk about the Sixers. What happened was, and this guy Jamal Rashad did a great job going into guys that the NBA wanted to change, and they really wouldn't. Derrick Rose was one of them. Kobe was one of them. And Allen Iverson was another one. And it's sad, but it's true. If you look at how, especially the talking heads on ESPN after their athletes, when they become commentators, and even players that are playing, you see Mahomes, you see a lot of players this way, and you see them off the field and they're a lot different. They really want their black players to act as white as humanly possible. And I see it with Keyshawn, I see it with Sherman, I see it with RG3. It literally sounds like they are doing the Chappelle bit when he's imitating a white guy. Like, that's how bad it sounds. Well, Allen Iverson was not doing this. He was not going to comply. And I don't think they had plans for him. I think they wanted him out of the league. The problem was he played for Philly, and the fans loved him. They wanted him to drop the do-rag, drop the headband. Instead, the fans started wearing them all. And suddenly, the organization, the NBA, had no problem with it so long they were complimented by Allen Iverson jerseys that they bought in the arena. So basically, he was so popular, kind of like a CM Punk type deal, they had no choice but to comply. And not only did they comply, but I genuinely think this is why they got those wins against the Pacers, against the Bucks, which are considered by even analysts, anybody on ESPN, as games that were completely messed up. And they might not say rigged, but the Sixers were definitely helped to get all the way to the finals. And of course it makes perfect sense, because now you have the underdog Allen Iverson versus the stacked Lakers, the most passionate fan base in the world, and they're in the corner of the underdog. And again, in my opinion, this one is just a perfect example of perfect babyface versus heel booking, where you just have a good guy and a bad guy, and they have, not that Kobe was a bad guy, or Shaq, or Phil Jackson, but when you have a stacked team like that, it's like when Jimmy was going against the Nuggets. Everyone was rooting for Jimmy. It's the same thing with AI, only it was way, way more impressive, if you think about it. Now, The next one's probably the most obvious. Like I said, there's a bunch of different sectors of this that my mind is trying to wrap around without jumping all over the place. But they do tie in together. The draw factor, the rivalries, the gimmicks, the storylines. But this next part that I want to go into, I think, is the most Ryback. Who are they comparing him to? This is a great comparison, actually. But it's the international appeal. I've gone into this a lot in almost probably like one every 4 or 5 videos. I will bring up why I like a team or a player because of international appeal. Now, the Spurs were doing this for a bit. Obviously, they had guys from France. I think they had Patty Mills from Australia. They had different guys coming in. And now they have Wemby, of course. And Hakeem, he's from Africa. He was on the Rockets in the 90s. So obviously this was happening. But if you think of it, I can't think of many players, if any, in the NFL that came from France or came from England. I'm sure there's a few, but I just can't think of many international. But what they're doing is suddenly they have this craving to go perform in Germany, to perform in England, and I wouldn't be surprised if they started performing in Saudi Arabia soon, just because of the money that's to be had. WWE understood this. They understood this logic a very, very long time ago, the benefit of international audiences, and that's why you had the Iron Sheik, you had luchadors, you had Canadians, Africans, Japanese stars, Samoans. Every lineage was covered because they understood the international appeal. Now, I think football has a harder time doing this because they're competing with football, with what the rest of the world sees as football. Basketball is a little easier because you just have other countries playing basketball, and it's easier to tap into a market already watching the sport. So, I think that's why NBA is bringing in all of these international players. But I don't think it's a coincidence. We've had so many international success MVPs in the last several years. Finals, obviously. Even the Raptors just got one, so you could even call that international. It's pretty coincidental that we've had more international success in a few years than we had in hundreds. And you could say, oh, it's a newer time. Well, no. Wrestling was scouting international talent, and nothing was stopping other sports from doing the same thing. So, the international appeal to me seems like something they realize, wow, this is really working for WWE. We need to tap into this. And again, these guys aren't just coming out of nowhere. It's like they're being bred or something, or being given some different type of water. You look at how easy Jokic makes it look. Luka, these again just coming out of nowhere. Embiid, Giannis, and again, Giannis was not that good. To me, if they wanted tomorrow, they could take his brother, one of his brothers, and replace him and push his brother. And after a long enough time, people would believe his brother's that good. I think they just probably got the most athletic Antetokounmpo of the bunch, and they ran with him. But he's a perfect example of a guy that really could have failed, and they probably just made sure there's no way he was going to fail. They made him into a complete monster. So, and speaking of international appeal, for those who don't know, the AEW owner, Saeed Khan, does own the Jaguars, who will be going to England. He just did Wembley there he sold out Wembley because of CM Punk, one of his wrestling pay-per-views. So again, we have an owner now that has stakes in both. So I always find that interesting. And I'd gone into the long-term booking, well, more of the short-term booking, but the long-term booking is another thing they're doing now. You see it in the NBA with the Suns and then the Warriors. You see it with franchises where they talk about this team's been beating this team from so. You just saw it with Michigan and Ohio State. You always see some long-term, and of course you're going to get that naturally. But you do have fans in the NFL that really care about their team's all-time record against another team. And the NFL pushes these long-time rivalries. And it's the same way WWE pushes the long-term storytelling. And like I said, we just saw Kelsey versus Kelsey. Or now we're going to, KD versus the Warriors and Chris Paul, who just left the Suns. Drew Holiday's on the Celtics, and they're playing the Bucks. They just played the Bucks, actually. They're probably going to be playing in the Eastern Conference. And you just see it over and over and over. And again, it's long-term booking, in my opinion. Now, the one aspect of long-term booking where these athletes really, really need to work on their game is the injuries. I go to Patrick Mahomes a lot, but just watch him in the Super Bowl. He was at halftime holding his leg out in agony because he was in so much, quote, pain, and he had this moderate ankle sprain. And then he's sprinting down the field later in the game, completely no-selling it. And even if they jacked him up with the best morphine on the planet, the Laudits, everything, every pill they could think of, it wouldn't make a difference. If you have a leg that is sprained and or any kind of ligament damage, anything where there's no give, you're still going to have a limp. You're going to be slowed down. Adrenaline isn't going to stop that from happening. If you watch Cody Rhodes when he fought Seth with his pec torn off his chest, you could see it hanging there. You could see the bruising. The arm was limp. He couldn't move it. Every time he made a motion where he even vibrated, you saw him wince in pain because it was a real injury. Now again, he fought through that real injury where most guys in the NFL, NBA miss weeks at a time and for far or less. And again, they're being paid to supposedly win games. Cody's not getting paid to win matches. So he didn't have to do that. And that's why I respect wrestlers way more than these football players and these basketball players. But if you look at it, again, Trevor Lawrence just did it with an injured knee. Lamar was supposedly hurt. Odell Beckham. We had the Chargers tonight. I'm gonna go into all that in tomorrow's game in another video. But it is really interesting if you think about it, because anytime they say someone's hurt or maybe might not be doing good, they just seem to play better than ever. And again, it's a wrestling tactic. They'll use Jedi mind tricks like, oh, he looked a little banged up, but he said he was working on this and he looks like he's in good form, or whatever the case may be, to explain away these injuries. But you watch a wrestling fake injury, not the Cody one because that was real, but you watch a fake injury in wrestling, and it's more believable than these athletes who have supposed real injuries. And again, it's like I said, just like the announcers explain away the injuries, they do the exact same thing with narration. They plant these seeds throughout the games, before the games, and a lot of it has to do with injuries, and a lot of it just has to do with the players themselves. I had gone into Powell. They have people convinced Joe Namath is this Hall of Famer who has, again, a 50% completion rate and way more interceptions than touchdowns and just horrible stats in general. But he was a draw. Russell Westbrook was a guy that carried the team. If you think about it realistically for a second, let's pretend it's real. He stayed on the sinking ship the longest. He didn't leave. He stayed there. He did everything he could. I think he won MVP, or they said he was snubbed. I thought he won it when he basically averaged a triple-double before they made that thing just a normal occurrence now, where everybody seems to be putting up triple-doubles on one night. We got two guys basically averaging one. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh yeah, Russell's always been garbage. And it's just because the media's mocked him for long enough, nobody even questions it. People believe this man is worth $4 million when Gabe Vincent's getting like $6 million. It's absolutely absurd. And obviously he knows. It's like Sheamus in WWE. He knows, all right, I'm never going to be the guy. I'll just happily live out my career. But they've just turned him into a complete jobber, and it really makes no sense because, I mean, it makes sense they want to push different people, but how blindly people bought into this Westbrook narrative, which, again, from all things that I can see, off the court, the guy is a class act. He probably just doesn't have the IQ that they need, the basketball IQ that they need, the look that they want, and while he's probably entertaining, there's probably a bunch more players that they like more than him. Or maybe he just doesn't want to go as far as really scripting these games. He doesn't really want to be a part of it, so he never really got that shot. But there's a reason they're having him job. And like I said, they do the same thing. They steal this from wrestling. So in wrestling, they'll have a guy job, which means a jobber is just a guy who does the job. He sucks. And suddenly, he'll be a star. If you guys heard of Jinder Mahal, he was a wrestler, complete jobber. He always lost. He always put over other people. He got squashed in like 2 minutes. And then within like 3 or 4 months, he's being treated like he can't be beaten. He's beating Randy Orton. And it was because the WWE had just struck a deal with India. So, of course, they're going to book Jinder as this top star when he just never was. And again, they change it all the time, and they do it in both. They do it in WWE. If a guy gets over, they'll keep it, and they do it in the NFL. You know that you see them do it with rookies, notably, Lionert, Reggie Bush, Vince Young, Tebow, and they'll bring these guys up, and you do need to have athleticism, just like in wrestling. You know, you can't be a wrestler that can't lift anybody or can't dive or can't cut a promo. Just like in football, you need to be able to speak in the post conference. You need to be able to call audibles. You need to be able to be smart. You have to be able to make those scripted passes, choreograph these, I'll say, matches in a way so it doesn't look obvious. So they do definitely need actually athletic people. But you'll see them just pull the plug on guys. You'll see them bring in certain guys, and then within a year, even if they had a good rookie year or a couple years in, they've been doing really good. And then we just stop hearing about them. And I don't think it's a coincidence. I wish Jamal Rashad's video wasn't taken down because he really expounded on it, at least in the NBA. But again, Brady's another guy where he would never have been that good. We all know it. You know, we got him number one as the GOAT, but right here. But he really never would have been this good unless they absolutely wanted it. Obviously, we had the Brady tuck, which started the whole thing. And again, he probably screwed that up. He was probably supposed to not fumble the ball there, and they had to find a way to make sure that the game went as according to plan. But you just see him, especially as he got older and he couldn't even make basic throws. You just really see how it's not just that he's not athletic. You can be not athletic and still make it work. But he didn't have anything that Peyton didn't have, or Warren Moon, or Steve Young, or any of these other quarterbacks. You could say, like, oh, it was a system. Again, I think it's all scripted. My point is, anybody could have been plugged in there and it would have been fine. And now they're even making a point of making the Patriots look just terrible ever since he left. And I don't think that's a coincidence either. So it could just be rammed down people's throats how good Brady was. But clearly he was born into some type of bloodline, in my opinion, some type of very rich family. Probably, you know, the Mannings, obviously, a family of big stature, but I think Brady probably comes from an even more powerful one. And it reminds me of Brock Purdy, it really does. You know, they just kind of plugged this guy in, plugged him into the system, and he's kind of the new guy that they're going with. So, I do think that wrestling WWE talks about the bloodline, and I honestly think, again, they're kind of dropping some comms, because I think that they do happen in all sports. There's just some players that there's no way they would ever make it if they didn't have certain connections, come from certain families. And I don't think we hear from like Brady's, like where he comes from, and the real untouchables. They say LeBron, you know, something about his dad. We don't know who that is. And I think it's because they're very corrupt families who want to be kept secret. You know, they always say the people you see aren't the evil. It's the ones that you don't see. So again, at the end of the day, they're both sports entertainment. And this is something else I wanted to go into. Every time I bring up sports entertainment, there's someone who will say, oh, well, the NFL classifies as that because they want to get tax breaks like the WWE. WWE does not get tax loopholes because they're sports entertainment. The IRS does not care if you're entertainment or competition. The reason that they get these tax loopholes is because all of their wrestlers are 1099 independent contractors. They are not employed. And there's a reason WWE does this. So I actually think there's a really good chance that the NFL players, the NBA players, are also independent contractors, or something to that extent. I don't believe the numbers that they give us, because I just don't think they pay a guy like Daniel Jones that much money only to eat it, like knowing that he's really not good. It just doesn't make sense. So I think they put out fake numbers, fake contracts. I think most of the money they make is from kickbacks from script, you know, the gambling kickbacks, merchandise deals, just like wrestlers. I really believe that. And I brought this up earlier, but the fake injuries by both of them, and it happens in the NBA, they never sell them. And it's just something that is becoming way more blatant. Even if you watch, like, there's so many videos out there of people that think it's real, you know, but they'll joke about Anthony Davis being injured but looking fine, and all these different players, and how they'll say they're healthy as a horse, and next thing you know, they're limping out to the court. They're bringing out the wheelchair. Like it's just ridiculous. Like they sell it in the worst way possible. So, like I said, if you don't believe me, you could just watch Cody Rhodes' Hell in a Cell, and see how they actually sell an injury. But to me, it just makes no sense. Outside of the fact that, again, they have to train to be strong, to be fast, and to coordinate these games. So they really don't have years of training that they could work on to sell injuries, fake injuries, just like wrestlers do. You know, wrestlers have to hone their craft for such a long time. And I think for a football player, they're trying to remember all these different things. It's not easy for them to remember, oh yeah, and I have to pretend that my Achilles is a little messed up here. And I think that's why we see such laughable attempts at wrestlers trying to sell these injuries. So yeah, like I said, I didn't want to make this too long, but it's also something I didn't want to just fly through either. I really wanted to cover the main aspects that I believe the NFL and the NBA have just completely stolen from the WWE. One being obviously, like I said, the Super Bowl, just copying WrestleMania. If like the spectacle aspect of it, the long term booking where you have rivalries, the way these the glove, it, Larry Legend, Magic, all these guys at MJ, they all had different gimmicks. Rodman was like the Menace, who by the way he went to WCW, so they all had a gimmick and they all had a defining characteristic, like Hakeem Olajuwon with the blocks. And this came along right around the same time as we had the Macho Man and the Warrior and Mr. Perfect and all these people. So I just don't think it's a coincidence. I think at the very least, people have to concede they have definitely copied WWE in so many ways. It went from being teams to players, and I think they're trying to get back to that team aspect. But again, for the longest time, it wasn't the Bulls versus the Pistons. It was the Bad Boys with IT versus MJ. It was Larry versus Magic. It was Larry versus MJ. It was a completely different atmosphere, and this is again timing up almost perfectly with when WrestleMania got big and the pay-per-views and what they call the golden years of professional wrestling. And it was when they started pushing their stars. And again, Hogan and Jordan basically run parallel. Hogan was around a little bit longer, of course, before Jordan, but he wasn't Hogan until he really got to the WWE, and McMahon was like, I want to copy Marvel and make all these guys superheroes. And again, you see it so much more in the NBA and the NFL nowadays. They'll show like Wemby standing next to a guy that's like 5'3", so that we could see how tall he is. Or even like a tall guy that's considered tall versus the average human. Maybe like a 6'3" guy that's, I wouldn't consider that tall myself, but again, it's all comparative. But most people will consider 6'3" pretty tall, and Wemby's towering above him and things like that. And he looks like Andre the freaking Giant. And I think we're only going to see more of it going forward, where basically everybody's got a nickname, everybody's got a gimmick. And with WWE merging with TKO, I think it's only going to be more, or not with TKO, with UFC. That's not a red flag, right? And now they both work under TKO. I think people are really going to start seeing, not just in UFC, but because they're now an umbrella basically with ESPN, partnered with ESPN, I think people are really going to start seeing the parallels. I notice the rivalries, I notice the gimmicks, I notice most importantly the draws. In no world should Joe Namath be a Hall of Famer. In no world should an NBA, as Nick Wright puts it, the guy with the most points, the most rings, and the most MVPs. He had the most points up until earlier this year or last year. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar be considered number 3, or not even in the top 3, but you can't call Jordan not the best. When Kareem's got him beaten every category. Came into the league, was already the greatest player of all time as far as college. Won basically immediately. Won throughout his career. Won at the age of 41. But he wasn't a draw. If they could have came up with a Kareem shoe deal, they certainly would have. He would be the greatest of all time. It was the fact that Nike stood to make billions off of the name of Michael Jordan. He was a draw. Chicago is a ridiculous fan base, them in Philadelphia. And it's not a coincidence, some of the biggest draws came from there. And like I said, the East versus West they really, like before Jordan, and it was with Jordan too, but they really pushed it. If you look at just the history of sports, look at the most successful teams. You got the Yankees, you got the Dodgers, you got the San Francisco 49ers, you got the Celtics, you got the Lakers. It's pretty interesting. I'm not saying obviously you're going to have more money in those markets, but you're really just appealing to whoever's going to be able to pay the most money. And especially back in the 80s, 90s, it definitely was a thing of coast. It was battle of the coasts. Yankees are a little bit of an outlier because they've been around forever, and who knows what was going on in the freaking early 1900s. I'm not going to pretend I did. But as far as watching it evolve from the 60s, 70s to the 80s, 90s, and then obviously into present day, I think people will see it more and more and more just how much these two or these two different entities have in common in sports and WWE. For those who haven't seen John Cena do the ESPYs, pretty revealing. Obviously it's tongue in cheek, but he's not telling any lies. I can say that. So yeah, I'm curious what you people think. I know most people that watch believe it's scripted, and there's a few that don't. So if you don't, I'm curious if you think it's all coincidence. If you think maybe they're just both evolving with the times. See, I would believe, okay, they're just both evolving with the times. If it wasn't one company completely getting copied every step of the way, like WWE has been doing these things way longer than the other leagues. The only thing WWE that I can think of copied others, they copied Marvel, like I said, as far as making superheroes. But as far as the theatrics, as far as the way they get the stars, like now especially on social media, you get these little clips. Oh, look what this guy did. Look what this guy did. Look what AD did. Oh, look at the look on his face. Uh, the gimmicks, all these different things. They just weren't around before WWE started doing it. So if you have an idea of where they're coming from, how it originated, and I think it originated in NFL. Like I said, Joe Namath is probably the first guy I can think of, and then you had like Dion, but obviously Joe Namath was way before that. So, and it wasn't just Dion. You had so many other guys. You had Lawrence Taylor. You had Bradshaw. You had the Steel Curtain. You had Barry. But my point is, Dion was probably, he's on Ric Flair's Mount Rushmore of trash talkers. So obviously the guy was a different level. But Joe Namath, there's a reason he was called Broadway Joe. They needed a star, and they got one. So if you can look at Joe Namath in the Hall of Fame and tell me it's real, and that man really deserves to be there, and he should have been starting for that team for any reason, I'd love to hear your argument. I get quarterback stats weren't as good as they were today, but they weren't that bad. I mean, you look at other quarterbacks. Bradshaw had some bad stats. I don't think they were that bad. I think Bradshaw at least had like 55 or something completion, or I could be wrong, but I remember his passer rating wasn't abysmal when I looked at it. It was a couple years ago, but because I remember saying like, man, Bradshaw wasn't that good, but again at the time I think I thought it was still real because I don't really look up old stats really for any reason. I looked up Namath just to make sure I was right because I remember thinking, why was this guy considered that good? Was it really because of that one super? Even on paper, even if we assume he really did that, I still don't think it warrants being in the Hall of Fame. If it does, then there's a lot of quarterbacks that should be demanding entry into the Hall of Fame, including Brad Johnson and that guy from the Ravens, Trent Dilfer. So yeah, like I said, I'm curious what you guys think. If you noticed more commonalities, maybe one I didn't mention, because I obviously people that watch the channel of different ages have seen different eras of not only wrestling but different eras of football and basketball, and I really, I'm an old head, so even though I'm a 90s guy, I watched these sports and I watched whether it's movies, TV, music, I always watch the old stuff first. So I've seen stuff dating back to, the 50s and such. I haven't watched like George Mikan, but I have seen, maybe not 50s. Well, wrestling I've watched basically back to the 50s. Wrestling, I didn't realize this was around when Abe Lincoln was a professional wrestler, which is pretty crazy if you realize wrestling's been around that long. But I started watching wrestling when I was a kid, but I watched that back really, really far. Not football really as much, but I did watch a lot of this Unitas stuff, a lot of the Namath stuff, and it's really interesting, especially seeing Namath. It made it all kind of stand out for me where I was like, wait a second, like, maybe being a draw is just a little more important than winning. And of course he won, but again, that was a very scripted Super Bowl. So yeah, this Super Bowl should be an interesting one. I'm curious to see. Obviously, we'll be doing a lot of videos before it anyway, but it's going to be another spectacle. It's going to be a crazy performance. I predict The Rock will probably be there. It's The Rock. He can't resist, and it should be really interesting. But the one commonality I will notice that I haven't mentioned, anytime you see I kind of mentioned it with the championships, but anytime you see a NFL player talking to a wrestler, they completely geek out. Shannon Sharper's doing it with Ric Flair, and it's almost like they can't believe that wrestlers are that tough, which makes me question their toughness. It's like, oh man, you're reacting like you just saw somebody cut their foot off because this guy's saying he wrestled through an injury. It's like that means you probably never would have played through that injury. And I'm not saying Shannon Sharp in particular, but anybody that interviews a wrestler, and I just saw the Ric Flair Shannon Sharp one, it was pretty good. They act like these guys are superheroes, and maybe they're just putting them over, but I would wager to say it's because most of these guys would not do too good as wrestlers. They just don't have the toughness. And look at Pat McAfee, perfect example. This guy talks for a living, he talks about football, and he transitioned into wrestling in such a perfect way where it was like he was calling the same sport. And again, I genuinely believe it's because he knows they're both scripted, so he knows how to call scripted action. I don't think you become that much of a natural calling wrestling commentary when you've never called it before, unless you're used to giving commentary on scripted sports. So he was a shoo-in, and I think that's pretty revealing in itself. Not to mention, again, all of the Karl Malone, all of the NFL, NBA guys that came over to wrestling at some point or another. The list is not a short one, it's a very long one. So yeah, to me, it was important to go into this video because I do so many picks off of narratives, and I thought it'd be really important to go into why I think that matters and why I think it matters in the sports. Like I said, the international appeal alone, I think, is going to help us tremendously going forward. I think Luka's getting MVP for one. I think it means Wemby is definitely not going to bust. He's going to have a good enough rookie year to win Rookie of the Year, and he's probably going to get the exact same treatment Giannis got. It probably lets us know that Embiid will win a championship before Booker. It's just things like that I think will really help us in the long run, knowing that they're going to be catering to an international audience. So I'm curious to see what happens, obviously, going forward with all of the sports, and I'll be going into, again, the rest of my picks. We have tonight's game, of course, but I really did want to go into this and just go into, the biggest 5 or so reasons that I think, and examples of the NFL, the NBA, these other sports. I didn't really go into the other ones because you don't see it in baseball that much. You don't see it in hockey, but you really do see it in the NBA and the NFL. How they just have no shame and completely copying WWE, with the one difference being they actually pretend what they're doing is real, when they are all, at the end of the day, sports entertainment. And like I said, the people that wrote the damn goofy movie are the ones responsible for these NFL, NBA matchups. So like I said, I hope you guys found this to be revealing. Maybe a lot of times when I see something from a different perspective, I'll be like, oh man, you know what, I was thinking of this and now this all makes sense. So maybe something that you might have been thinking of regarding Michael, regarding Larry, Joe Namath, any of these guys, any of these goons, Tom Brady, of course. Rookies that should have made it but didn't. It might make a little more sense now. And yeah, if you're, I know I did a lot of wrestling talk, so if you're unfamiliar with how wrestling works, if you're completely new to wrestling, have any questions, just let me know and I'll expound on what I meant. So take care and happy earnings.